Welcome along, everybody. Really nice to see you joining us today. I'm Gareth Mitchell here in London, and I'm your friendly moderator for today's Frontiers in Science Deep Dive. As ever, this is an international gathering. We have a whole load of countries and institutes joining us here. In fact, over 90 countries represented, including the Netherlands, Brazil, Germany, the US, Japan, and the UK. So you're very welcome to join us. This is our flagship multidisciplinary open access journal at Frontiers. And this is where we publish exceptional peer-reviewed lead articles on transformational science, taking on the global challenges facing all of us and our planet. We publish these articles across unique hubs with content to suit all kinds of audiences, extending our reach and impact for those engaged with science, policy, and society. And in fact, so far, we've published 30 hubs spanning 115 articles covering a whole range of transformational science. The research has been cited over 1,220 times, and it's been viewed over 3.8 million times. And we regularly get picked up by the media, so you may well have seen our world-leading research on the news and on the telly. Now, as for today, this deep dive focuses on our lead article, Obesity and Climate Change, Co-Crises with Common Solutions. Leading the work is Professor Jeff Hoddy, and it's great to give this article and its hub a home in Frontiers for Science. And I'll show you around that hub in just a moment. But let's first set the scene for today's discussion. So, this is civilization now in the 21st century, a global population rapidly getting fatter, munching on calorie-rich, low-fiber, nutrition-poor, ultra-processed foods. These snacks and so-called meals are convenient, they're cheap, they're plentiful, and they're pushed at us and our children by aggressive marketing campaigns. Most of all, the stuff is just so tasty. These are foods that are precision engineered to keep us coming back for more. Though not everyone argues that necessarily makes them addictive, and I really look forward to hearing our expert views on that aspect of things today. But what isn't contested is that obesity is one of the world's most urgent health challenges. Over 2.6 billion people, over a third of the world's population, are living with excess weight or obesity, and that's projected to reach 50% by 2035. We expect the greatest increases to be in children and adolescents. And that, of course, places an increasingly unsustainable burden on our health systems and the planet. These are hardly eco-foods. And emissions-intensive livestock pushes both calorie intake and greenhouse gases ever upwards. And there's a class issue here too. In fact, we hear about that in one of the viewpoint pieces that accompanies today's lead article. The less well off are trapped in a vicious cycle, really, on an ultra-processed diet, progressively getting poorer and fatter, with healthy foods slipping ever further out of reach. But despite the mounting crisis, the policymakers seem to be basically nowhere around. And it's not for a lack of evidence for these foods' adverse effects. So, thanks to our experts today and their excellent research, there's even less of an excuse for our policymakers to look the other way. So, today we're exploring how we can change our obesogenic, unsustainable food environments to achieve healthier, more sustainable outcomes for people and the planet. So, there you go. That's a little bit of context for you. But before we meet our experts, let's just show you around quickly. This is the article hub. And alongside the lead article on the hub, we also have two editorials. One comes from Dr. Sydney Pryor and Professor William Dietz of the Milken Institute School of Public Health at George Washington University in the US. And the other editorial is by Tim Lang, Emeritus Professor of Food Policy at City St George's University of London. Alongside that, we have two viewpoint articles. One is by Professor Paolo Vinis from the Department of Epidemiology and Biostatistics at Imperial College London. And the other viewpoint comes from Dr. Radhe Basiri and Professor Lawrence Cheskin at George Mason University in the US. Not only that, but we also have a very handy lay explainer. There's a video and a version of the lead article in Frontiers for Young Minds, and that's our science journal for kids. So there you go. We've got you settled in. You know your way around the hub now. Let's tell you about the order of proceedings today, and then we'll get going. First, we're going to hear from the authors of the lead article, Professors Jeff Holley, Jason Halford, and Catherine Samaras, and also Paul Behrens. Then joining us for the panel discussion is going to be Maggie Retzel from the World Obesity Federation. We're going to start by saying a very big hello to Jeff Holley, Emeritus Professor of Clinical Science at the University of Bristol in the UK, a leading expert in the endocrine and metabolic drivers of obesity as a complex systemic disease. His research on insulin-like growth factors and IGF binding proteins in chronic human disease has really shaped our understanding of how IGF signaling intersects with cancer risk, obesity, and endocrine dysfunction. Jeff has contributed to some very influential work examining the interplay between obesity, diabetes, and COVID-19, and more recently to interdisciplinary analyses linking obesity with climate change as interconnected global crises. A champion of systems level solutions, Jeff combines clinical insight with translational science and policy engagement to inform evidence based strategies that improve both human and planetary health. He's also field chief editor of Frontiers in Endocrinology. So he's one of our family as well. So Jeff, can't wait to hear your presentation. So do jump in. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Gareth. Since the age of enlightenment and the scientific revolution of the 16th and 17th centuries, humans have created a truly amazing world. But over the last few decades, we've also created a number of crises for ourselves that are now seriously jeopardizing our future progress. Within just a couple of generations, we've managed to dramatically change our own phenotype. In evolutionary terms, this is unprecedented and has occurred in just a blink of an eye. Over a similar time frame, we've also managed to dramatically change our environment. According to a report just last month from some of the leading climate experts, we're now on the brink of slipping into an unstoppable hothouse world that could threaten the very existence of society as we know it. Now, these two crises have much in common and many parallels. They're both essentially problems of energy balance. They are both manifestations of overconsumption, and they are both ultimately driven by profit. Now, these crises have a hugely complex scientific base. And for this article, we brought together a very broad multidisciplinary team of experts to assess this vast scientific evidence base and see whether we could see what was driving these crises and whether there's anything we could do about it. And we found that indeed there are many parallels between the obesity and the climate co-crisis. They both have a very broad scientific base with a huge amount of evidence. We've never been in such a good position to have such a vast amount of information to address our problems. And in both cases, the science does give clear indications of what we need to do and what could be effective at tackling these crises. However, despite this, as societies in general, we're failing to do what is needed. And this is at least in part because actioning the science has itself become incredibly complicated and has to overcome issues due to societal issues, commercial and economic pressures, and political issues. And astonishingly, in some parts of the world now, the acceptance of scientific evidence itself has become a political issue. And on that sad note, I'll pass you back to Gareth, who will introduce the experts who will take you through some of the key issues in much more detail. Thank you, Gareth.
Okay, indeed. Thank you very much indeed for that, Jeff, and a very thought-provoking intro to our session. So, Jeff, thank you very much for that. Our next speaker is Jason Halford, Professor of Biological Psychology and Health Behaviours at the University of Leeds in the UK. And Jason is a leading authority on appetite regulation and obesity, and he's worked extensively with patient groups, policymakers, NGOs, and the World Health Organization. Jason is past president of the European Association for the Study of Obesity and is former chair of the UK Association for the Study of Obesity as well. So, Jason, over to you. What do you have to say?
Good morning, everybody. Thanks, Gareth, and thanks, Jeff, for the excellent introduction. Now, I'd like to talk a little bit about the drivers of obesity. And we have to start with the premise that there is a strong biological component to obesity. Obesity is a disease with biological drivers. And we know this because of the genetics of obesity. There is strong genetic predisposition in some individuals more than others to become or live with obesity. And these are through genes which influence fat storage and metabolism, but particularly appetite and food reward as well. We know the heritability of obesity is between 40 and 70%. And we also know epigenetics, early life environment, shapes that genetic processing as well. And that has an impact on lifelong weight regulation. Now, how do these things express themselves? Well, they express themselves in people's eating behavior, how their appetite is expressed. And what we see with people living with obesity, particularly at higher BMI levels or with binge eating, is reduced within meal satiation. Meals do not fill people up the same way when you're living with obesity. And after the meal does not suppress appetite in the same way. So there's also a deficit in post-meal satiety. But that's really the homeostatic side of things. There's also the hedonic and reward side of things. We know people living with obesity have greater responsiveness to food cues, which are not dampened down by food intake. They have increased disinhibition and problems in food control. They feel the food is in control of them rather than they are in control of the food. And all these traits have strong genetic components: neuroregulation, which controls appetite and satiety, food cravings, and even eating responses to stress as well. But there is more modern or novel things to think about. One of these concepts I'd like to introduce is the concept of food noise. And that's the persistent, unwanted, and intrusive thoughts about food that really distract or disrupt people's lives. It's a constant soundtrack or barrage which they're powerless to stop. And this really speaks to the patient experience because as new treatments have come online, particularly the GLP-1s, patients report that what the drugs are doing are cancelling that food noise, the food noise which they've been living with, which makes controlling their eating behavior so challenging. Now, we're thinking about eating behavior. We know that there are lots of eating behaviors or eating behavior types. There's emotional eating, which is associated with binge eating, depression, anxiety, stress, and coping, and that leads to temptations and lapses. There's external eating, which is very driven by the external food environment, which is very obesity promoting, which promotes overconsumption. And linked to that is mindless eating, eating while distracted or attending to appetite controls. We know reward-driven eating is driven by high-fat, high-sugar foods, which are energy dense, such as snacks, and these are now being characterized with a new term called ultra-processed as well. But what's also driving them is larger meal portions. And we know that eating pattern of away from home, skipping breakfast, and particular foods and beverages high in sugar and fat are associated with obesity. Now, I said a little bit about energy dense and ultra processed foods, but we know that these foods are designed to be hyper palatable, cheap, and convenient, and also shelf stable as well, which is one of the important functions of ultra processed foods. They're high in sugar and fat and salt, so they overstimulate the reward pathways. They're also low in fiber and protein, which weakens their satiety signals. And often they have soft textures as well, which makes it easier for them to be consumed more rapidly, which also promotes higher energy intake. Liquid calories, particularly sugars, have minimal impact on appetite control, and people tend to consume more calories without noticing when consuming ultra processed foods because of the energy density, and we've termed that passive overconsumption. Now, the modern environment is critical in this. Although I've talked about the genetics and obesity disease, it's the modern environment which triggers the expression of obesity. It's the ubiquitous availability of cheap, energy-dense, ultra-processed foods, the aggressive marketing, particularly to children. That's not just on television, it's online. Large portion sizes in restaurants and packaged foods. We've seen portion sizes increase, and a convenience culture of takeaways, particularly delivery apps as well, and grab-and-go snacks. And we can characterize the neighborhoods many people are living in now as food deserts, limited with access to fresh and healthy foods, but also food swamps, areas saturated with fast food outlets and convenience stores. And there are other drivers, including physical, socioeconomic, commercial, and the digital environment, which I won't have time to talk about today. I now pass on to the next speaker.
That is great. Thank you very much indeed for that, Jason, and very thought-provoking. And I know exactly what you mean, especially when you say these foods are, they're kind of engineered to be kind of really kind of soft and so easy to eat. So you're packing all those calories in really quickly, and within 5 minutes, you're not full up, and you go back for more. So you've really set out, the psychological basis for that and what's going on kind of behind the scenes, really, with these food manufacturers and how millions of people around the world are being kind of manipulated into eating this highly Moorish but ultimately damaging food. Thank you very much indeed for that, Jason. Let's say hello to our next speaker then, Professor Catherine Samaras, consultant physician and endocrinologist at St. Vincent's Hospital in Sydney. She's also Professor of Medicine at the University of New South Wales. Now, Catherine has led pioneering work clarifying the clinical consequences of visceral adiposity and the metabolic benefits of weight loss interventions, including bariatric surgery. Through translational research and clinical leadership, Catherine has helped redefine obesity as a complex systemic disease, and she's advanced evidence-based strategies to improve long-term metabolic and cardiovascular health. So, Catherine, a very warm welcome. The floor is yours. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Gareth. Right, so Gareth's already told us about this global epidemic. Just to reinforce, 38% of the world's population. And if we continue the trajectory that we've been on, by 2050, 1 in 2 people in the world will be obese. So 2.6 billion people affected. Do we have the health resources to treat all these people? I assert no, we can't. We're struggling now. Now, the rate of adult obesity has doubled since the 1980s and increased by 60% of children who used to be spared from obesity. And we can see why this is with the advent of entertainment in your hands constantly, the increasing sedentariness of our world, the reduction of physical activity and physical activity engagement. But we've already also heard about the socio-demographic determinants. We call it postcode discrimination. You live in certain areas, you don't have parks to play in, there is nowhere to walk that is safe. You have to be driven to school because it's either too far away or it's not safe to necessarily get there. These are important factors that we must address. From a medical perspective, obesity is the major cause of first cancer. It is the second biggest preventable cause of cancer after smoking. We know it is the major cause of type 2 diabetes, and it accelerates the onset, particularly in childhood, of type 1 diabetes, a sentence of insulin injections every single day, often up to 4 or 5 times per day. Heart disease, hypertension, hyperlipidemia, obstructive sleep apnea, liver disease, where obesity has several iterations. The metabolism-associated fatty liver disease, which is now much more prevalent than alcoholic liver disease. Cirrhosis, of course, is the outcome of that, and cirrhosis increases the risk for hepatocellular cancer. So seeing that link from metabolic disease through to cancer generation. Obesity is a major cause of arthritis. Think pain, think impairment, disability, and if you can afford it and have access to it, joint replacement. And it's never the same. Reflux disease, of course, autoimmune diseases are caused or accelerated by obesity. And the polycystic ovary syndrome, which people don't sort of think is that important, but it is the major cause of infertility. So it is, these are all just minor things. So why is this so? Well, think about adipose tissue as a source of inflammatory cytokines. These are chemicals that circulate in the system, and they erode every single organ from the tip of our toes to our brain. The liver we've talked about, coronary arteries, any artery, atherosclerosis, the liver, our bones, our muscles. The systemic inflammation is important, but I also want to touch on nutrient toxicity. So when you have an excess of energy for your own physiology, and so it's very individualized, and genetics play a major role there too. If you overwhelm your own intrinsic capacity to deal with energy, then you have nutrient toxicity. You start to wear down the cell organelles, the mitochondria wear out, the endoplasmic reticulum. This is deeply biological. But then you start to experience cell death, cell dropout, and degenerative disease. There are people who are very interested in longevity. They're very careful with their diet. If you want to live longer, you have to calorie restrict. We know that. So the physiology is fascinating, but it doesn't help us understand and address obesity and manage it well. Obesity treatment is extremely challenging. The narratives that are used is that there is long-term failure and what I hate the word recidivism, which blames the individual suffering from the condition from what is essentially an environment that they have little power to change. So I think it helps to think about and frame obese people being stuck in a situation where we're asking them to buck what, in my view, is a pervasive adverse environment where there are factors promoting and driving overconsumption and sedentariness. And we're requiring individuals to make those changes with, for example, reduced caloric intake, below what they were eating before, but not only today, not only tomorrow and next month, but forever. We're asking them to increase their physical activity in places where they're time poor, don't have access to safe places to exercise, might be stuck in a car commuting for 3, sometimes 4 hours a day. And when they finally get to their workplace, they're chained to a desk. And we want them to increase their physical activity today, tomorrow, forever. We're asking people to alter their reward systems, and sometimes people are really challenged in finding other things that really switch on their brain and give them pleasure. And we apply a range of psychological interventions. Ideally, it's not just cognitive behavioral therapy, but we're tailor-making it for the individual. And we're asking people to make those changes now, tomorrow, and forever. And if you are bored by hearing me repeat now, tomorrow, forever, put yourself in the shoes of somebody that lives with obesity and has lived with it, and they're trying to make those changes every day for the rest of their lives. It is a huge challenge. So apart from those lifestyle changes, we have a number of treatments, which I'll touch upon, to assist people make that change. And so the pharmacotherapy and bariatric surgery, I'm going to start by framing this as nothing works unless you change behavior. But both those interventions can help people change their behaviors. Jason's already touched upon reduction of the food noise and the intrusive food thoughts, the food torture that people often refer to. And they can help people reduce their energy intake long term, experience satiety. I hear things like, is this what normal people feel like? I actually have never felt like this in my entire life. Where is the food noise? And I actually feel full after eating half what I used to. It also helps people combat the constant environmental drivers to consume energy. And if I can have a very short vignette, we know the science has shown us that you simply need a visual trigger of a food. It can be any food. You don't have to smell it. You don't have to feel it. You don't have to hold it in your hand or chew it or taste it. But one will trigger a whole range of hormones that promote energy consumption, food consumption, and storage. So if you happen to live in a place like I do, where public transport in my state is run by the New South Wales government, they accept money from food advertisers and they plaster our buses with food ads. So you're just quietly going about your day with all of your commitments made for the day, and suddenly a bus passes you and you're thinking, yeah, that looks good. I think I might get me some of that. So I think it's really important to think about, to again, put ourselves in the shoes of people. And even with the various pharmacotherapies and bariatric surgery, they're still trying to battle those environmental drivers. There's very few of us that can go and live on a desert island where we completely manage our environment. We've touched upon the GLP-1 receptor agonists. These are semaglutide, tirzepatide. There are more coming, highly effective. In 5 to 6 years, we know they reduce heart attack, heart failure, stroke, death from all of those causes, sleep apnea. Diabetes rates reduce very rapidly or is very well controlled with these medications. But what happens after that 5 to 6 year mark? We lack long-term efficacy data. We also lack that longer-term safety data. And this is a real issue when you are thinking about treating children or adolescents who at a very young age are obese with agents that don't have that long-term safety data. We also know that there can be high rates of adverse effects, particularly if there is a lack of medical guidance. And to that I allude to increasingly corporate efforts for dispensing pharmacies to have somebody online prescribing, and they've never seen the patient. There is no counselling, there is no dietary instruction, and there's certainly no monitoring for adverse effects and complications. Bariatric surgery has 20 years safety data showing that successful weight reduction reduces cancer, diabetes, and heart disease. But it has real risk and high rates of adverse effects. And for many people, they never eat normally ever again. Lifelong medical supervision is required, along with lifelong supplementation to avoid vitamin and mineral deficiencies. So, in my view, obesity is best prevented because it is so hard to treat. Not only do we not have long-term safe interventions, we actually do not have the workforce, the medical workforce, and most health systems will break if we use the two types of interventions that I have alluded to already. We have to understand that the environment is also influenced by corporations who manipulate health policy. We will hear more on health policy, but these are just two papers that are evidence showing that there is interference with, for example, the United States' Centers for Disease Control, and also for exercise, promoting exercise, because a narrative has been exerted in China suggesting that it's all just sedentariness causing obesity rather than the food supply. So I think we need to be aware that there is influence of health departments and health policy by the people who make most of the profit from people becoming obese. And so we can be flippant about it and say, yes, just lock your fridge and prevent eating. But I wouldn't mind just commenting on something that was published now 6 years ago from the Lancet Oncology that asked governments to take a stronger position on their public health strategies and not be unduly influenced by powerful multinationals who might be more concerned with protecting their own interests than helping solve this ongoing health crisis. I think it always helps to remind ourselves of this. And so I will end on that and thank you for your attention.
Great. Thank you very much indeed for that, Catherine. And I think really what you're saying there is that once people are trapped in obesity, it is so hard to turn that back. And some of the most effective treatments, when rolled out at scale, population level, will health services and health systems, they just can't support that. So we just need to prevent obesity in the first place. And as you started going into there at the end, Catherine, you know, policy and governance must be a big part of that. And the intersection really between regulators, governments, and the big corporations that are producing these ultra processed foods. Catherine, Thank you very much indeed for that. Last but not least, definitely not least, we're going to hear from Paul Behrens. And Paul's very interesting. He's a professor at both the University of Oxford and Leiden University. And he's a passionate science communicator. And in fact, Paul's voice has informed international debates on sustainable diets and planetary boundaries, helping to share evidence-based pathways towards food systems that support both human and planetary health. Paul's work has made headline news and it's won in the title of the 2023 Frontiers Planet Prize International Champion. Paul, you've got quite a pedigree, so I can't wait to hear what you have to say. Over to you.
Thanks so much, Gareth, and thanks very much for the other presentations. I'll be building on what my excellent colleagues have been talking about. First of all, we've moved from a system where we've had a fairly basic food system, where with pretty simple supply chains, to a system that looks more like this on the right, where we've got an imperative for growth. We've got an imperative to externalize the costs of food systems to generate larger profits. So that means externalizing and not paying for the environmental harms, the social harms. And we've got highly resource intensive supply chains that spread all over the world. And obesity is one of the many outcomes of a malfunctioning food system. These are tied up together. What I'm showing here are the planetary boundaries. And we can see that the planetary boundaries for each of these different environmental crises, the safe operating space in the green there, and we can see how we're exceeding many of them at the moment. And when we look across these different boundaries, we can see that food systems is the second largest driver of climate change, the largest driver of biodiversity loss, the largest driver of land system change, the largest driver of freshwater change, the largest driver of biogeochemical flows. These are flows that kill aquatic life, of ocean acidification, atmospheric aerosol loading, and of novel entities in the forms of plastics and other types of pollution. On top of this, food systems are first for driving zoonotic diseases, and likely first for antimicrobial resistance as well, because we use an awful lot of antibiotics in the food system. And the majority, when we look across all of this, is driven by the way in which we do animal agriculture today. And so when we look at what options we have for actually reducing these pressures and living on the planet for the long term, shifting to a plant-rich diet would save the most emissions. And across all of those other dimensions, it would make even more of an impact. So this is work out from a colleague of mine. And we can see on the right here that we've got the business as usual emissions on the left-hand bar. Across, we've got all the different types of interventions that you can imagine. And plant-rich diets offer the greatest opportunity that we have. And this is critically important in high-income nations. So while you see that bar being quite important globally, or most important globally, this bar is even larger in high-income nations. So for example, in the UK, we would reduce our emissions by about 61% by making this shift. And so ultimately, the reason why we want to make this plant-rich shift is when we look at the different emissions per product, we can see that they're highly weighted towards the animal products. So beef here, 50 times, 100 times the emissions of the plant-based proteins. We also don't have the land. We're relying on a lot of the land to do the biodiversity work, to do the climate work that we need to draw down emissions from the atmosphere. And again, the meat products use many hundred times more land than the plant products. Our diets are also a question of more and more resilience, because we've got these huge food system security issues coming up, whereby climate change is impacting our ability to actually produce this food and then what's available to us. And this is becoming more and more a national security issue. So in different countries, you might see shortages, but in general, seeing some level of additional food price inflation to our food prices, and that is a surefire way to destabilize societies. So this is the diet, the most sort of common diet out there that's good for ourselves and good for the planet. And what we're showing here is what this plate of food would look like. So it's dominated by fruits and vegetables, some whole grains, some plant-based protein, and some smaller amounts of animal source protein and dairy, for example. And note, it's perfectly possible to eat fewer animal products than this, but this is a sort of middle of the road, sort of where we need to get to for environmental sustainability in the long term. So how not to change this? How not to move from a system that we currently got today to this future system that's more resilient, that has healthier diets, healthier for the planet? Well, we don't want to focus on individual behavior alone. This is the same for obesity as it is for climate action. Focusing on individual behavior alone disincentivizes that possibility for systemic change. Of course, we need it both because they interact together, but we don't want to do individual behavior alone. And not to rely on get out of jail free cards. And so in climate change, this might be like technological solutions where we can draw down carbon. But in obesity, we're still talking about things like surgery, feed additives, in diets where we could actually reduce emissions from animal agriculture, for example, and GLP-RAs, which has been touched on by Catherine just now. They have their place, but we're not reforming the food system if we are relying on GLP-1s. 1RA, sorry. And when we look across the food consumption options, so this is a study out quite recently looking at the different interventions we can make on the demand side, we can see that overwhelmingly more impactful is changing the food environment. So changing the availability and the defaults of foods that are available to us, rather than just relying on labeling and other sorts of interventions which may not make that difference. And this is a key point that we make in our paper, that we really need to change the food environment. And the food environment is incredibly complicated. So there's a quite complicated figure here, which you can pause and take a look at in your own time. But some selected interventions that we want to start bringing in are things like true cost accounting. We want to start thinking about taxation, the shifting of subsidies, reformulation of foods so that they're healthier and better for the planet, public procurement so that people are eating healthier food that's better for the planet in public institutions, greener by default, and learning from other experiences like New York hospitals, which went plant-based and found a really positive result. They saved money, people enjoyed it more, and they got better health as a result. And also things like the Danish Plant-Rich Action Plan, which is encouraging people in Denmark to eat more plants. We shouldn't be under no illusions about what we're facing here. This is the amount that's spent on agribusiness lobbying compared to defense and oil spending in the US through the years. And what you can see here is that agribusiness spending is higher than even defense and oil and gas, which you might think of some of the biggest lobbyists out there. And we're starting to see this again also in the food system, where we've got large interests pushing a narrative that we should be eating more meat. And it's the same playbook, discrediting the science, disseminating false information, spreading confusion, and promoting doubt. And in fact, it's the same companies that are involved in this as well. So the same companies that have represented big oil and big tobacco in the past are now representing big food. And I think this highlights real questions of the role of science in society and how can scientists get their voice out in a system that is so overwhelmingly driven towards some of these interests. And I just want to finish off today by talking about one of the reasons why I'm so excited about, especially people in high income nations and upper middle income nations, moving towards eating more plants, because the benefits are astounding. So we can reduce our agricultural emissions substantially. We can provide carbon storage by using the saved land to draw down carbon. We can meet climate targets. We can meet nature targets because we save so much land. We have better flood resilience. We have improved mental health by access to nature that we'll be able to get through making these changes and saving that land. That would obviously have huge impacts on obesity as well, and health and fitness. We could even have forestry, timber, buildings, bioplastic, other economic activities on that land. We'd have cleaner water, cleaner air. We'd have healthier diets, of course. We'd improve productivity if people are feeling healthier. So these are economic arguments, of course, and I think there are sort of moral arguments that we need to employ to encourage governments to change the food environment, of course. But we've also got these economic arguments. So even from a hard-nosed economic sense, it's good for us. Save money for health systems around the world, improve food security, increase agricultural income. In some countries, we might even be able to increase agricultural income if we do this well. And in many countries, provide a rural renaissance. So if we look at countries such as the UK, the US, some of the high income countries around the world, some of the rural areas are really struggling under the burden of many different requirements for the land and under climate impacts. So I will leave it there and look forward to the discussion in a moment.
Great. Thank you very much indeed for that, Paul. And I'm so pleased that you finished on those positive notes about, solutions are out there. But I'm still reading from what you're saying about how big food lobbies as much, in fact, if not more, than international defence. That tells us quite a lot about the predicament that we're in. Paul, thank you very much indeed. So we're going to open this out now to a discussion, and to really get that discussion going. We're going to meet one other person who's going to join us for the panel. This is Maggie Wetzel at the World Obesity Forum, where Maggie has a key role in advocacy around obesity and has a policy focus. And her work focuses really on translating scientific research into actionable policy and strengthening political commitment and supporting countries to implement systems-based approaches to obesity prevention and care. She previously held roles within the Argentine National Congress, the United Nations Programme for Development, and World Cancer Research Fund International. Not only that, but Maggie has played a key role in shaping international advocacy strategies that frame obesity as a complex, chronic disease requiring coordinated action across health, food, economic, and environmental systems. So, Maggie, let's get the discussion going with you. And of course, this is very timely because yesterday, the 4th of March, was World Obesity Day. So, I wonder if you can tell us a little bit about what you guys are doing at the World Obesity Federation around campaigning, the role you're playing in reforming the whole kind of landscape when it comes to the foods that millions, maybe billions of people around the world consume.
Thanks, Gareth. Yes, definitely billions. So every 4th of March, we lead World Obesity Day. We convene multiple actors. We have a huge campaign, sometimes in person. We offer webinars and all around social media and the press, hopefully, fingers crossed. So the theme for this year was 8 billion reasons to act on obesity, because we are 8 billion people in this earth. But currently we have around 3 billion people with overweight and obesity, and we're looking to be 4 billion with overweight and obesity within the next decade. So we're looking at numbers of overweight and obesity rising very, very fast. We focused a bit more on childhood obesity this year because every year we launch our World Obesity Atlas. So our atlas showed this year that 1 in 5 school-aged children have overweight and obesity right now. This is, I don't know if you've seen the UNICEF report from last year. As of last year, there is currently more children with obesity than with undernutrition. So we're seeing a huge paradigm shift. And I think that part of the conversations that we've had around ultra-processed foods are a big part of what's driving this rapid rise. And part of the slogan, a part of the theme around 8 billion reasons to act is because as you've seen in the discussions today, that obesity is a multifactorial disease. Everyone's got a role to play. So it's not just food systems, food production, but there's also a health systems response, government response. So, from government, health systems, food systems, we're making an argument for a multi-sectoral response to obesity as a multifactorial disease. So this is partly what the message that we're trying to convene people around, moving away from individual blame for obesity towards systems action and getting everyone involved, hence the 8 billion reasons.
Yeah, and of course, blaming people doesn't get us anywhere, really, does it? So, I think you're absolutely right on that. And of course, international bodies like the World Health Organization are working on all kinds of new food guidelines. But Maggie, what are the biggest challenges in even getting the different countries around the world and different regions to agree on what ultra-processed foods are?
Well, I think there's an I think there's an implementation challenge as well, because there are many countries that already have some regulations in place. I mean, they have soda tax, there's sodium reduction targets, there's restriction of marketing. So every country is at a different stage of where they are at regulating their food systems, and ultra processed foods are a part of this food system. So not only looking at how we're regulating these specific nutrients, I think the challenge is how do we regulate the food system as a whole, and how is that going to coexist? So say new guidelines on UPF regulation, how are they going to coexist with the already implemented nutrient profiling models that say lots of Latin American countries have? So the Pan American Health Organization, there's already a nutrient profiling model that says how many parts, of sugar. So how are we regulating that? How is that going to coexist from global to contexts nationally? And the other challenge, I think, is managing conflict of interest. There's corporations and food industry influence sometimes involved in the discussion around definitions, the discussion around regulation. So we have to be very careful about what actors are being involved in decision making, and management of conflict of interest is, I think, one key challenge. And I don't think that any country right now is actually, I'm not going to say doing a good job, but there's influence everywhere.
Yeah. All right. So Jeff, kind of getting onto the clinical side of things here and picking up on some of what you were saying in your talk, and we're hearing now about these, the weight loss drugs, the GLP-1 receptor agonists. What do we know, if anything, about the long-term effects of these drugs? Especially if we're talking about maybe giving them to children or adolescents. What do we know about the potential dangers around that?
Well, we know from very limited data at the moment that's only over a few years that they appear to be very good. The dangers of being living with obesity are much greater than the dangers of living with these drugs over a couple of years. But longer term, we just haven't got the data yet. And the worry in children is that human childhood is the longest of any species because we're adapting to a complex environment and hoping to live long lives. And part of that adaptation is kind of programming the whole endocrine system. So if you perturb that endocrine system in that developmental period, we just don't know what the long-term consequences are. We know from studies, long-term studies, such as the children of the 90s in Bristol, but other studies that followed people through generations, that exposures in childhood have long-term effects much later in life on the instances of many chronic diseases. So altering the endocrine system in childhood is, I think, a dangerous prospect when there's alternatives of, as Kathy very rightly said, the best solution is to avoid getting into the problem rather than trying to pick it up later and not
Yeah.
knowing what the long-term consequences really are.
Yeah, indeed. And Catherine, of course, that was your big message. Let's not get into the problem in the first place. But on the other hand, look, we are where we are. So, we need to talk about these weight loss drugs. And, you were talking about bariatric surgery in your talk. What is the danger of either of these methods and the many others? These kind of quick fixes, maybe the danger that they become band-aids, as it were, and we don't really move on to meaningful interventions that stop obesity in the first place.
Gareth, I mean, you make a very good point. I see my role as a clinician to enable people to try and make behavior change chronically and support them. Now, that may include pharmacotherapy. Given the risks of bariatric surgery, that's now down the list of interventions that we might offer people to support their long-term behavior change. But if we just look at the GLP-1s, some of the common side effects are nausea, vomiting, reflux. There are cases of pancreatitis. There is often a very significant slowing of the gastrointestinal tract, so people suffer from constipation. Rarely they will have some diarrhea, but the most common thing is constipation. And we have to help people understand how to regulate their bowels and have an appropriate diet to maintain some regular bowel habit. The bariatric side can have immediate surgical complications, like where they might cut just comes apart and you've got peritonitis and other terrible complications. For a lot of people, there is reflux, terrible reflux, so that they often will, even though we give greatly detailed nutritional instruction, it's much easier to get the soft food down through an obstruction, which essentially is surgically engineered, than it is to eat a salad, for example, that just gets stuck. So in some regards, we have, if somebody's having bariatric surgery because nothing else has helped them, then we have to offer lifelong nutritional instruction and, not to be critical, but our role is to help and enable. So that may include, this is the way you need to cook your vegetables in the future. Forget raw vegetables, they're just going to get stuck. You're going to have to cook them as slightly soft, pureed, baked, whatever. And I didn't go into medicine thinking I'd be giving people cooking lessons, but it makes a difference and it's worthwhile, and it is worthwhile. And, if we talk about cooking lessons, I meet people, we have a heart-lung transplant unit at my hospital, and a lot of people don't get on the lists because they're too overweight. So we have a program that helps people get on the transplant list. And for some of my dear patients, you have to teach them that there is something called tap water, and your fluids don't come from a bottle constantly. And weaning 45-year-olds off a constant intake of carbonated, sugar-sweetened beverages to drink the vilified tap water, because there has been a big industry in vilifying perfectly healthy tap water in order to promote consumption of other things. These are economic, political factors that we have to deal with at an everyday level in medicine now.
Yeah. Well, docs, you'll be very glad to hear that I am drinking water here during this presentation, because in my view, those fizzy carbonated drinks, they don't quench your thirst either. So anyway, that's just me. So I'm very much team Catherine there on that. Now, Jason, let me come to you. I'm going to ask you. A lot of people talk about these ultra processed foods as being addictive, because let's face it, they're very Moorish. People can't stop eating them. Are they addictive in a strict kind of psychological sense?
I think the problem with the term addiction is it's escaped into general use. Lots of people say things are addictive, because bits of the brain reward system light up. I mean, there was a brilliant study which showed that for Republicans, pictures of George Bush let their brains light up. So it doesn't necessarily mean they were addicted to George Bush. But I think something important is here, because food which is high in sugar, high in fat, and high in salt, and is energy dense and is easy to consume, is very rewarding. And our biology drives us to this, because these are things in nature which are very, very rare, and in culture would normally be treats, would normally be infrequently consumed. When they start making up the body of the diet, that's when we have a problem. And we're in this vicious circle that consumers are driving for this food, so the food industry is providing it and promoting it, and we've got ourselves locked in this cycle, driving consumption of ultra processed foods. Now, ultra processing or processing does other things like keeps food on the shelf for longer and things like that. And there's no reason why we can't produce energy dilute, healthy processed food, which was more plant-based. That, not everybody can make food from fresh fruits and vegetables. Not everybody has that ability, the facilities, the knowledge, or the skills. But we can alter the food system to make sure that we're actually producing processed foods along with fresh foods that meet our dietary needs, which are not highly palatable and driving over consumption, and are not using vast amounts of resources, particularly when we've talked about the production of protein through meat.
Yeah, but some people might say, well, that's all very well, but some of these plant-based alternatives, they're more expensive. You know, people don't have money, so you just go and get the cheapo, ultra-processed stuff.
Well, this is the thing about food security and food insecurity. It's providing foods for people which are nutritious, healthy, meet their needs. They're not in caloric deficit. They can access them regularly. They're affordable, but also they're acceptable. So one of the challenges we have to is produce foods which are acceptable for people living with obesity, for the population in general, which are better for the planet. And that's a really big challenge, given that we've got ourselves in this vicious cycle. But remember, you always have to think of the person at the end, the person living with obesity, the person in a deprived community. And I think they need to be part of the conversation. Okay.
Yeah.
Nothing for them without them.
Yeah, indeed. Absolutely. And that brings us brilliantly actually to a very good point that Rajaswari Raina has made, or Raina. And I'm going to paraphrase here a little bit, but the question is around, you know, how normalized these kinds of foods now are. And I'm going to put this to you, Paul. These foods become normalized for a reason, and you gave us a great big hint there where you talk about the amount of lobbying that's going on the behalf of big food. We heard Jason there saying we need to include the people, the end users, the end eaters in these decisions. So the question is, you know, how do we make sure the right people are in the room with enough power to actually change things? Otherwise, we'll be having this same debate in 10, 20 years' time, and it'll be even more urgent by then.
Yeah, well, thanks, Gareth. Just to pick up on a couple of things, so this idea that they're more expensive is less and less true, and I think nowadays they're about parity in terms of protein, the alternatives. And one of the reasons for that is because of environmental damage, and the environmental damage on those animal food systems. It tends to be greater because you've got both the animals that are suffering and also the feed that's going through to those animals are getting more expensive. So as time is going on, we're seeing this change. And maybe just quickly to also reflect on the GLP-1s, this has a really important aspect for the food system transformation as well, is because what we're seeing is we're wanting people to have more protein necessarily if they're on GLP-1s. And so that's something that's coming through, especially older people who might be taking GLP-1s. But of course, if we then substitute that with animal proteins, not only is that over-consuming things that are bad for us, but we've also got all of these environmental damages from it. So we really need this protein transition for that in mind as well. Now, coming back to that point about, how do you get everybody in the room? I think what we need to move towards is to a system where we've got more community hubs, more community resilience in food systems. And this is going to become more and more important as climate change hits, as biodiversity loss gets worse. And what we're going to really want to see is we're going to want to see these communities around different countries facilitated maybe from top down, but have this bottom up approach where communities are involved in the food that's being produced nearby, how resilient it is between the producers as well, and what's available. And I think, we're kind of somewhat going to be forced to do this because of the climate damages.
Yeah, and I think Jeff, you wanted to get in, didn't you?
Just in response to your comment about the costs of the different foods and the plant-based alternatives being more expensive, and that comes back to Paul's point that he made about the externalizing the costs that the grazing beef takes up a lot of land and has a lot of environmental costs, which the food manufacturers don't have to bear. The society bears those costs. So we need to get together to convince policymakers that they need to subsidize the foods that are healthy for us and don't have an environmental damage. And not subsidize the foods. We've been in a crazy situation in many countries that for years most of the agricultural subsidy has gone to dairy and meat and very little to plant. And yet the dietary guidelines from the same government is eat more plants and less meat and dairy. And that's just nonsense. So taking away those external costs of building them in will take away that cost differential that you're worried about.
Yeah, all right. And it brings us very nicely to a kind of a point that a whole load of you, and I'm talking to you, dear viewers and listeners around the world, that you've been making. So, I'm going to kind of lump some of your thoughts on this into a single question. So, if you were asking about, how you take into account like regional differences, regional policy differences, cultural differences, and translate that into some kind of meaningful international policy, if that was on your mind, then we are listening, and we're going to put that actually to Maggie, our policy and advocacy person in the room. In fact, all of you do some policy and advocacy, but you know what I mean. Maggie was talking a lot about the work she's been doing, and we had World Obesity Day yesterday as well. So really, Maggie, the question is, how do we take account of these differences, these regional differences, to effectively design more feasible and more localized plans to adjust things and to denormalize all these ultra processed foods?
I wonder, there's going to be possibly lots of the climate change community here, but could we adapt? Could we bring on the concept of just transition to this, for example? Because if we're talking about subsidies, if we're talking about what's to become more accessible to people, we're also talking about, the fastest growing obesity rates are in low and middle income countries. So this reality around having healthier but more expensive foods be, more inaccessible than the ultra processed foods. This is a lot of the reality that these communities are faced. Same things for, the 1 billion people living with obesity. I think that accessibility to these medicines is also something that needs to be discussed in a way that suits contexts and regional differences. But I think that one thing is clear is that we need to address both, right? We need to address it around the diets and around the health system's access. And all of this then involves multiple actors in society and coordinating around different ministries. So I think that this is one of the biggest challenges. How do we integrate, for example, obesity prevention and care into universal health coverage benefit packages? Like how is this then across the life course something that, Catherine brought it up really well. This is something that needs to accompany people at risk of obesity or with obesity through the life course. So how are we making sure that this is happening all across the life course?
No, absolutely. And Catherine, you were saying that you went into this career expecting to be doing surgery and medicine, and you've kind of ended up alongside all that, giving people cooking lessons and dietary advice. And that feeds into a question again. I'm lumping together lots of different people who have been asking this question in the audience today about food labeling. And in many countries we have the traffic light system, so you can see how many calories, saturated fat, those kinds of things. But that still doesn't necessarily tell you, does it, whether a food is ultra processed or not? Especially as on the packet, it might have lovely words like organic, and the packaging might have a lovely papery, crinkly kind of quality to it, and you think, oh, how wholesome. And people think they're buying something that's very healthy. It may not be. So what about improving food labeling?
I think food labeling can be helpful, but as we've already heard, the potential impact for it is low. The Australian food labels separate sugar and carbohydrates, so all the food manufacturers just shift their sugars to a complex carbohydrate, don't declare it's a sugar, and it comes across as a healthier food. Look, a lot of my patients say when they look at health labels, they just look at the number of ingredients in the product. And if it has more than 3 or 4, they think, it's a bit processed, I'll ignore it. And I really like that as a simple mechanism, thinking, yes, this hasn't been interfered with too much. The ultra processing it's just a way of looking at interfering with food. It's a way of maximizing profit by increasing the shelf life of particular nutrients and trying to put it back together again. And it's kind of like you have something that's beautiful and made by nature, and then you have something constructed by man. It's never going to be the same.
Yeah.
And once you start manipulating it to increase palatability, then you've got much more consumption and so forth. So I think food labeling can be helpful. There can be unhelpful food labeling. For a long time, I won't mention specific names or foundations, but we've had food labeling that was paid for by food companies that led consumers to believe they were healthier. and they were not. Foods that, for example, were labeled high fat but were full of sugars. I mean, that's still happening. Foods that contain non-saturated fats but contain other fats that are not particularly helpful. I think you just have to come back to how processed is this? How close is it to nature? And then you have to actually address food security and you have to address access. There are rural towns in Australia that have no fresh food. People just have processed supermarket food. There are people who just cannot afford organic, providore provided fruit straight from the door. They have budgets. So I think in that regard, we can look at where the subsidies can actually help. We've been running initiatives for refugees and for people with severe mental illness, where there is fresh food provided for people. So they just come to I'll give it a plug, Addie's Kitchen in Marrickville, where people with severe mental illness, people that live under the poverty line, people who are refugees and don't have work, can come and collect fresh food like they would in a supermarket. And that's really challenging. That requires charity. It requires a lot of goodwill, and a lot of donations. But these things are helpful when there are no overarching policies that taxpayers and community can rely upon when government has turned their gaze away.
Yeah, all right. Thank you, Catherine. Jason, I wonder if I can address a question to you from Teresa Legros, who asks about like obesity-related stigma. So the question is, how should weight-based stigma be addressed and inclusivity ensured when developing and delivering individual-level interventions, designing policy, systems, and environmental interventions, and conducting research? So, Jason, what about stigma around weight?
Stigma is a big issue. People living with obesity. It impacts on the way they're treated generally. It impacts their interface with the healthcare system as well. People living with obesity often have bad experience to the healthcare system and won't necessarily engage with the healthcare system for fear of being judged. And, there are many enlightened colleagues in the healthcare system who understand obesity disease, but many people just think it's a lifestyle issue as well. So this just put down to the individual's lifestyle. You just need to eat a bit less, do a bit more. Well, people living with obesity have been told that message all their lives, and they're still living with obesity. So what happens is they internalize that. They internalize that failure, and that leads to mental health problems. You've got mental health problems, and you're less motivated. You're not in a good place in terms of your weight management journey. So stigma is a thing, and it has to be challenged at every level. And so we do need to do a more work around education in general about obesity as a disease, not a lifestyle issue. We do need to work with healthcare practitioners, and we also need to work with policymakers as well. So we need to get that message through. But so when an individual living with obesity has their first contact with a healthcare professional, that contact is respectful, that patient is listened to, and that patient's needs and priorities are addressed. And their priorities won't just be about weight. It will be about health and other things. We shouldn't just reduce it to a conversation about weight.
Yeah, no, well said. Yeah, people shouldn't have that feeling that they're going to be judged, even if it's maybe a slightly irrational fear that they will be judged when they go to the clinic. But if that's the way they feel, whatever, if that's the case at the clinic or not, if people feel like that, they're not going to step across the threshold in the first place, are they? So, okay, thank you very much indeed for that, Jason. So we've had this one from Jeff. For Jeff, I should say, combining, this is like, again, we've put together a load of questions just to, get the best out of this panel. This is Tom, Yoav, Livni, and others have raised this point. So here we go for you, Jeff. Tom refers to a study led by Kevin Hall that shows that when controlling for non-beverage energy density and hyperpalatability, there was no difference in calorie intake between minimally and processed and ultra-processed foods. So between minimally processed and ultra-processed foods. Should we, asks Tom, therefore focus more on calorie-rich, refined, and hyper-palatable food formulations rather than just demonizing all ultra-processed foods. Indeed, some UPFs are engineered to be beneficial, including lots of different medically formulated meal replacements. So, really, Tom is asking, do we need a bit more nuance around this, Jeff?
Absolutely, absolutely. Although there are now thousands of studies showing the adverse health effects of UPFs, not all UPFs are the same, and we need much more nuance going forward, and particularly which Paul is a real expert on the development of new sustainable foods. Plant-based foods, a lot of them are going to have to be ultra processed or processed considerably, and yet they should be designed to be healthy. So, in the past, the food industry has really concentrated on making their products moreish, because like any commercial company, they want to sell more of their product, and they've been very successful. But we need in the future to make sure that the products are not only healthy, but they're sustainable and don't make people ill. And the UPF label has been very useful in that it's highlighted what is actually driving the obesity epidemic. It's a very crude term, and we need much more sophistication and nuance on that.
Yeah. Okay. No, thank you, Jeff. And to continue that theme, let's put this to you, Paul. Can we define ultra-processed foods without referring to specific ingredients? Isn't it possible, as ultra-processing isn't the problem, some of the food ingredients are? Yeah. So what about the ingredient side of things here, Paul?
Yeah, well, I mean, maybe just to comment on this, in my view, ultra processed is best employed as a description of how the food system incentivizes certain outcomes rather than a category of foods. And so that's why we focus on energy dense UPFs. I think the current classification are too broad, the famous NOVA classification, and it lumps together these sort of energy dense, obesity promoting foods, sugary snacks, with beneficial foods such as soy-based meat alternatives and plant fortified milks. And the emerging literature on this shows that these plant-based options are substantially different for health, and they've got very different environmental profiles, and they can be much better for you, even if they end up in the same basket.
Mm,
I think one of the issues we have with this is that while I think health professionals have been looking for a sort of simple language to highlight this system, and UPF has been alighted on and really struck in the public imagination, I think unfortunately it has been also exploited by large meat and dairy companies who incorrectly claim that these plant-based alternatives are always going to be worse for health than meat itself. And so it's really muddied the waters, I think. And that this is one of the issues that sort of worries me going forwards is that there is this overriding sort of focus just on the level of processing. Actually, that's not where a lot of your health and your environmental benefits are going to come from. So I think we do have some precise tools. I mean, Catherine's already mentioned some of the different nutrient profiling tools around the world. And you can imagine a system where we add processing flags to that, where you say, well, there's a flag that this is processed in a certain way, rather than a pure sort of processing sort of taxonomy of foods. We could
mm,
even increase sort of or include things like explicit rates of consumption of different foods, so try and assess that and add that in there. We can try and look at hybrid systems where we get, categories of food with similar sort of health outcomes for similar sort of profiles, and then integrate some of these environmental harms into the measures as well. So,
yeah.
few ideas there.
Okay, no, thank you very much, Paul. And it's so important to kind of get those ideas out, isn't it? Quite a few people have been questioning us and putting in the Q&A. Thank you, by the way, audience, for doing that. About childhood obesity. Let's put this one to you, Maggie. So quite a few people have been asking about this. So when we're talking about kind of early life nutritional intervention, what about the role of looking at feeding practices, school meal management, regulating advertising to children and so on, and certainly on that advertising front here in the UK, and I'm sure in many other countries, it's a very live issue at the moment, advertising ultra processed foods to children. What about policy responses to that? Ultimately, to prevent obesity right at the early stages of life, so we don't have obese adults walking into Catherine's clinic.
I think that there's lots of opportunities there, and actually it connects really well. So quite some years ago, we had the Lancet Commission for the Global Syndemic, and that one actually pointed out breastfeeding, for example, as one that addresses all forms of malnutrition and the global syndemic of undernutrition, overweight and obesity, and climate change. So this is one key intervention that is also part not only of more of a societal and population level response around awareness raising, but it's also part of primary care and very childhood and maternal care. So there's lots of health systems interventions also that we can do around protecting breastfeeding from an early age. There is something very interesting came up as well in conversations we had this World Obesity Day around childhood obesity. There were many people asking, for example, around the role of the parents. And this also goes back to the fact that if we're looking at obesity as a multifactorial disease, it's okay, so we take the blame away from the child, but then are we putting it on the parents or on the school principal? So then again, here we're looking at systems level responses, right? So regulations around school environments and public transport, active transport, physical activity promotion, for example, is actually hugely determined by like air pollution and heat waves. So here we're also seeing a great opportunity to connect because, if we are addressing the drivers of climate change, then we're also going to address how children are more involved in physical activity, which has a huge impact on obesity prevention and mental health.
Yeah,
So there's
yeah.
lots of drivers that are
Oh,
very, very
excellent.
connected.
Thank you very much. And in fact, we're going to go a bit quick fire here as we get into the last 10 minutes. And Jeff, you had your hand up there because I was actually going to ask you about exercise because we've spoken a lot about calorie intake, not so much calorie expended, Jeff. Catherine led us into that with more exercise for kids at school, stopping them getting obese. Maybe you're going to say something else with your hand up, but can you talk just briefly about the role of exercise in this?
Uh, Clearly, we're leading a far too sedentary life, but the studies globally suggest that for the global obesity epidemic, it plays much less of a role than the food intake and the food environment. And the
Right.
point I was raising my hand for was regarding childhood obesity and that the role of education. And I think most of us in the obesity world think that there's far too little education on nutrition, as nutrition plays such an important role in your health throughout your life. That in schools, colleges, even in medical schools, there's far less emphasis on nutrition. And just to raise a couple of important uh, initiatives in Brazil, they mandate that the amount of UPFs procured for school food is minimalized, and they're gradually reducing the amount of in-school food. But in Vietnam, they've got a really progressive program where schools are mandated to use the land around to grow food, and the children are taught
I
how
love
to
it.
grow food, and that goes into their school meals, which I think is brilliant. And we should educate people the importance of food for their lifetime health and how to manage their own nutritional and food environment.
Okay. No, thank you very much for that, Jeff. And I love that idea. Yeah, of just yeah, not just children. I think all of us being more aware of where our food comes from, caring about that more. That's a big part of the equation here. So as we get into the final few moments, I'm going to get each of you. I'm going to go around each of you. I'm really asking you for your big, main, massive, important point that you want people to take away from this. So as I work my way around to you, as you're sitting there, dear panel, just be thinking now, what's the thing I haven't said that everybody needs to know? That if they don't know, I'll be cross when this session ends because now is your moment. I'm really building this up, aren't I? So where should we go? Let's go to you then, Paul, because you're on the left-hand side on my screen here. So I'm coming to you first. What's the big, massive, important point we need to take home?
Not giving me any time to think of something, but no,
So sorry.
I know, I know. I think the main thing that we all have to remember is that the food system is changing rapidly anyway. we are seeing massive impacts on the food system from environmental change. And this will only increase. By the end of the century, research is suggesting that we'll lose about a third of our agricultural land, about half of our grazing lands, due to it being inhospitable to grow food. That's the future we're facing.
Wow.
That ties very, very closely into the obesity crisis as well, and what we're eating and how we're eating and what the nutrients that we're getting. And so for me, I think, this all in terms of security, in terms of health, in terms of environmental impacts, this all points towards eating more plants. I'm not suggesting, vegan diets or anything, but just eating more plants and reducing our meat intake.
Yeah, and we heard that example from the New York hospital where they've tried it out and had amazing results. Great, thank you, Paul. Catherine, so big important point. So I've very much got in my mind now, tomorrow, and forever. Catherine.
We are two things, consumers and advocates. Every time we spend 5 cents, $1, we vote for something. We vote for a particular type of food that we like to have, or we vote for a particular type of food we don't want to buy. So sales count, and we can influence what food manufacturers present to us in the way we spend our money or we don't spend our money. And then the advocacy, just talk to anybody you possibly can who might be listening about how we need to prevent, and that is going to happen. It takes strong government, and strong government will be enabled and empowered if they think their voters are behind it. So advocate and complain to your politicians.
Yeah, absolutely. Is it a bit of a roadblock that the leader of a very influential country that we're probably all very aware of is very fond of the old fried chicken and the junk food? No comment, says Catherine. Very wise. Right. Jason, how about you? Big important point to take home, behaviorally, psychologically.
Well, obesity is a disease, not a choice. But we're in the situation, the genetics have not changed because a change in our food environment over the past 50 years. If the food environment can get us there, the food environment can also get us back. And remember, prevention supports treatment. So if you get the prevention right, when you're treating people living with obesity with GLP-1s, you're supporting them as well.
Great stuff. Yeah, so very much echoing Catherine as well. Prevention is just everything here, really, isn't it? Maggie, how about you? Big final point.
I think that we've mentioned a lot that this is a huge systems issue. So I want to echo what Jason said, but also, this transition that's happened, every country is at a different stage. So we need to be accounting for what stage they are in. The high income countries may be somewhere already where regulation will be more effective. But for other low and middle income countries where we are seeing huge rises, they're just right in the rise of it. So we need to look out for these contextual factors and also integrate people with lived experience and civil society in these conversations, because we are consumers, we are users, and we are also then the beneficiaries of these policies.
Yeah, and absolutely. And the real sense there is, especially with countries that are kind of further behind in this kind of hockey stick of rising obesity, there is real opportunities for intervention. So Jeff, let's look at the clock. You've got about a minute and a half. Let's call it a minute. What do you want to say?
Well, I think that the word that links it all is sustainability. We heard from Kathy that if we create an environment where half the world is going to have lifelong health problems, we just haven't got the health systems to cope with that. It's not sustainable. And as Paul said, we haven't got the climate or the land for the current food system. So we need to convince policymakers that they need to have policies that are sustainable. And the problem is that the first priority for most policymakers is economic growth. And food companies are very successful, and therefore they're very convincing that we can make lots of profit. But we need to convince the policymakers, and this is a multi-sector issue, as we've been discussing today. We need to get all the sectors together to convince the policymakers that they can't just pass on the problems to the next generations. We need a sustainable world.
Yeah, indeed. Thank you very much, Jeff. And as I was saying at the beginning, it does seem amazing. It's such an important and urgent issue the policy makers seem to be looking away, or at least they're listening to the wrong people. So let's hope that at least a few of them have been listening to us today. I think it could make a real difference. So huge thanks to all of you for that. We have heard, let's just name check them because they've been absolutely brilliant. Maggie Wetzel, Professors Jeff, Holly, Jason Halford, Catherine Samaras, and Paul Behrens. Catherine joining us quite late at night now from Australia. And of course, thank you all for joining us today. And I really hope you enjoyed the session. Please do remember to visit the Frontiers in Science website to access the article we've been discussing today. And of course, all the related content on the Hub. On social media, the conversation continues. It has to. The hashtag is FrontiersIn. As for this deep dive, from me, Gareth Mitchell, our guests, and the entire brilliant team at Frontiers, thank you, experts, and thank you around the world for watching. Bye-bye.